Call the Attorney-General.
Mr President, I move that standing orders be so far suspended as to enable petitions, the tabling of papers and questions without notice to be taken into consideration at 15 minutes past 2 o'clock.
And that's seconded. I'll put the question. Those for the question say aye. Against say no. The ayes have it, and I note the absolute majority. Clerk.
Notice of motion, Government Business number 1, the Attorney-General to move.
Call the Attorney-General.
Mr President, I move notice of motion, Government Business number 1, standing in my name, namely that I have leave to introduce a bill for an act to give First Nations people a voice that will be heard by the Parliament of South Australia, the Government of South Australia and other persons and bodies, to establish local First Nations voices and the State First Nations voice, to repeal the Aboriginal Lands Parliamentary Standing Committee Act 2003, to amend the Constitution Act and for other purposes.
Do we have a seconder? It's seconded. I'll put the question. Those for the question say aye. Against say no. The ayes have it. Bring it up.
A bill for an act to give First Nations people a voice that will be heard by the Parliament of South Australia, the Government of South Australia and other persons and bodies, to establish local First Nations voices and the State First Nations voice, to repeal the Aboriginal Lands Parliamentary Standing Committee Act 2003, to amend the Constitution Act 1934 and for other purposes.
Call the Attorney-General.
Mr President, I move that this bill now be read a second time. In doing so, I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. When in this chamber, we honour the lands of the Kaurna people, the traditional owners and custodians who have thrived and lived in balance on this land for thousands of generations. Where we are now, on Kaurna country, this whole state, the whole of this nation, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I extend my respect to Kaurna people, as well as to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the state. And, sir, I'm pleased that so many Aboriginal leaders and community members who've contributed on this bill have chosen to come to Parliament today. I'm grateful for your long-standing willingness to walk together with this and other governments and with the broader South Australian community. It's only when we work together that we can really make a difference. As my friend, Senator Pat Dodson, has said, reconciliation is a journey for all Australians. When we acknowledge our history and share this load, we help to unburden each other and the healing together begins. In the decades and centuries gone by, the laws of our state and that of the colony that preceded it have done so much to disadvantage, discriminate against and disempower Aboriginal people. Today, this government seeks to use the laws of our state to achieve exactly the reverse. I've worked in and around Aboriginal affairs for more than 2 decades now. I've had the privilege, both as the South Australian Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and in earlier roles, to be involved with a range of legislation, programs and initiatives created to support Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities. In all my experiences, the one thing I'm absolutely certain of is that services, programs, legal mechanisms that are created for Aboriginal people only work properly when Aboriginal people are directly involved in their design. Far too often in our history post-colonisation, it's been the practice of governments at every level not to invite, and quite often not to permit, Aboriginal people to be included in or contribute to the decisions that directly affect their lives. This means decisions have been made for Aboriginal people and not with them. The legislation I introduced today seeks to change that. Whether driven by well-intentioned ignorance or deliberate cruelty, the practice of excluding Aboriginal people from the decisions that affect them has, in our history, at best stood in the way of progress. At worst, it's been used as a tool of oppression and brutality, enshrining intentionally harmful policies in law, destroying families, communities and culture. Governments across every state and territory of our nation have failed to appropriately include and consult Aboriginal people for far too long. In May of 2017, when the Uluru Statement from the Heart was released, after many dozens of dialogues throughout the country, the momentum and good faith that had been built around a shared intention to make meaningful change for First Nations people filled so many with the vivid hope that real progress was imminent. For me, I remember a few months after that Uluru Statement was handed down, in August of 2017, being on Gumatj country in north-east Arnhem Land at the Garma Festival with the then Prime Minister, the then Opposition Leader, and many other governments and First Nations leaders who shared that hope. There was an air of elated anticipation, so potent you could almost reach out and grasp it. We'd arrived at an unprecedented moment in our history, a moment of opportunity for enduring change. The Uluru Statement from the Heart graciously showed us the path to arrive at the future we envisaged. The Uluru Statement is, as Minister Linda Burney has said, a generous invitation to the Australian people to walk together. That invitation was extended with gracious openness, and I hope it would be received by the Australian people in a similar spirit. The despair that followed later that year, when the federal government rejected the voice for Parliament proposed in the Uluru Statement, was devastating. It was devastating for First Nations communities around the nation, and indeed for any Australian who wished to see changed and wished to see that respect and courtesy given. I remember, sir, on the Sunday after the 2019 federal election, talking through tears of disappointment with Senator Dodson, lamenting the opportunity this nation had lost. It wasn't long after, in discussions with then Opposition Leader and now Premier, the Honourable Peter Malinauskas, that we decided we couldn't wait for the possibility for a federal government who would enact the Uluru Statement. That's why we, the now South Australian Government from opposition, as one of our very first policies, committed to the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart at a state level. We committed to take the significant and fundamentally important steps to begin to reverse the disenfranchisement and the disempowerment of South Australian Aboriginal people that the Uluru Statement invited us to take. With the introduction of this bill, we opened the door to a historic change. We can become the first jurisdiction in the nation to legislate for a voice to Parliament and a voice to government for First Nations people, empowering them to shape the decisions instead of being subject to them. Historically, South Australia has led the nation in reforms and legislations for Aboriginal people. It has been a proud cross-partisan tradition that we seek to build on today. Then Attorney-General and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs Don Dunstan's Aboriginal Lands Trust Act in 1966 conferred the first major recognition of Aboriginal land rights by any Australian government. The Unruh Pinjarra Yunkanjarra Land Rights Act 1981 was enacted during Premier David Tonkin's administration, providing Aboriginal people the right to claim their ancestral lands and to protect their cultural heritage, and that was followed by the Maralinga Jarracha Land Rights Act in 1984. Then Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Dean Brown, apologised to the stolen generations only 2 days after the handing down of the Bringing Them Home report in federal parliament in May of 1997. We were the first mainland state to implement a stolen generations reparations scheme. We were the first jurisdiction in the nation to begin treaty negotiations. These moments of leadership have occurred when we've listened to the voices of South Australian Aboriginal people. Now we are poised to lead the nation again, and make no mistake, the nation will be watching very closely ahead of a referendum to be held later this year. Now is our chance to demonstrate that First Nation voices should be a consistent leading force to achieve better outcomes and drive meaningful change. It gives us a powerful opportunity to send a powerful message about the recognition and respect First Nations people deserve in this state and in this nation. It must be a voice that is listened to and considered, one that is recognised for the unique perspective it provides, which is underpinned by its authority of culture and experience. This legislation has been shaped by extensive consultation aimed at ensuring the voice will be robust, informed and inclusive. In July last year, Mr Dale Aegis was appointed as South Australia's inaugural Commissioner for First Nations Voice. The Commissioner led 2 rounds of engagement with First Nations people around our state on both the concept and the design of the model. The first round of engagement occurred between August and October last year. Dozens of sessions with hundreds of Aboriginal people and organisations were held across the state, from the APY lands to St Una to Mount Gambier to many points in between. These processes and the Commissioner's subsequent engagement report informed the development of the First Nations Voice Bill 2022. A draft was released for a further round of engagement sessions and online engagement between November last year and January this year. During the rounds of community engagement, There was a strong and consistent discussion around the key principles that should inform the design of the voice. Some of these key principles were: the voice must be underpinned by self-determination, and as such, representatives must be chosen by First Nations communities themselves. The voice must come from the grassroots level and be able to speak for local issues. And the voice must reflect the diversity of First Nations communities. It must reflect regional issues, and it must speak for men's and women's issues, as well as for elders and for young people. These principles and the key issues raised during both rounds of engagements have closely informed the final version of the bill that I introduced today. In particular, the bill provides for representation at the local level and the state level that reflects the diversity amongst First Nations people and ensures the voices of First Nations people in South Australia are heard directly by this Parliament and by the South Australian Government. I now turn to some of the detail of the bill itself. Part 1 of the bill sets out important preliminary matters. In response to feedback from engagement sessions, the definitions of Aboriginal person and country have been replaced with First Nations person and traditional owner. The definition of First Nations person adopts the tripartite test as set out by Justice Brennan in Mabo v Queensland No. 2 and is commonly used by governments all around Australia. A reference to traditional owner in relation to a particular place is now modelled on references in other legislation. 2 new clauses have been included in Part 1 of the bill in response to concerns raised about the interaction of the voice with other bodies and agreements already in existence. Clause 7 makes it clear that the voice does not limit or otherwise affect the functions of any First Nations persons or bodies under any other act or law, or an agreement or arrangement entered into or relating to First Nations person or bodies, such as native title agreements, or anything that First Nations persons or bodies can do in accordance with First Nations tradition. Clause 8 makes it clear in the bill that it is intended to be read in conjunction with and to complement the provisions of any other act that implements measures to progress truth and treaty, as contemplated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Part 2 of the bill sets out the structure and functions of the voice at a local level. Regions will be established within South Australia that will be represented by independent First Nations voices with elected members. Pursuant to clauses 10 and 11 of the bill, the number of regions and the number of members that make up these local First Nations voices will be prescribed by regulation. Local First Nation voices will engage with local communities in order to determine matters of interest to First Nations people in its region and communicate those to the state First Nations voice. This process will be a collaborative process with the state First Nations voice. Local First Nations voices will also have a discretion to collaborate and assist public sector agencies and other organisations in the development of policies and procedures and engage with local government and other organisations of matters of interest to First Nations people in that region. Part 3 of the bill sets out the structure and functions of the voice at a state level. The membership of the state First Nations voice will be comprised of the joint presiding members, who must be of different genders, of each of the local First Nations voice. This state First Nations voice will represent the diversity of First Nations people in South Australia and is the body that will formally interact with the South Australian Parliament and the South Australian Government. In response to feedback, which sought greater recognition and representation for young persons, elders, native title holders, as well as members of the stolen generations, this bill now requires that the state voice establish specific committees to represent these important groups. The membership of these advisory committees is to come from the community and not from the membership of the existing elected state voice or local First Nations voice. Parts 4 and 5 of the bill set out the formal requirements for the state's First Nations voice interaction with the South Australian Parliament and the South Australian Government. The state First Nations voice will be notified of the introduction of each bill in the House of Assembly or the Legislative Council and will be able to address either, but not both of those chambers, through one of their joint presiding members in relation to any bill. The state First Nations voice must deliver an annual report and address a joint sitting of this Parliament and may present a report to Parliament on any matters of interest to First Nations people. To ensure that the issues raised in such reports are appropriately considered, the Minister is required to provide a response to the report, including whether any action has been taken or any action is proposed to be taken. Interactions between the state's First Nations voice and the South Australian Government will occur through required meetings with Cabinet, briefings with chief executives and through an annual engagement process. The ability to directly address the South Australian Parliament and to engage with Cabinet, Ministers and Chief Executives will give First Nations people the opportunity to influence decision-making at the highest levels and have their voice heard where it counts. The conduct of these elections is set out in Schedule 1 of the bill. Elections will be run by the Electoral Commission of South Australia and will, with the exception of the first election, be held at the same time as a state election. Transitional provisions will allow for the first election of members to be held as soon as possible after the commencement of this legislation. A First Nations person who is on the state electoral roll and who has completed a declaration of eligibility will be able to vote in the election for members of their local First Nations voice for the region in which they reside. A person who nominates as a candidate for their local First Nations voice is not restricted to nominating in the region to which they reside. Instead, they may choose to stand either where they reside or where that person is a traditional owner within South Australia. This bill embodies our government's commitment to the Uluru Statement of the Heart by giving First Nations people a direct voice to our Parliament and to the government. It's an important moment for our state, and the effects of our actions in this matter will extend far beyond our borders. I encourage each and every member in this place, and when it comes down to the House of Assembly, to take this reform to heart, to sincerely reflect on the opportunity that is before us and what it can mean for the future. Let us work together to ensure that First Nations people in South Australia are better empowered, more deeply valued and genuinely heard. For far too long, the First Nations of this state have been denied that formal and meaningful voice in the decisions that impact their lives and communities. For far too long, they've suffered the consequences of policies that have been imposed on them without their input or consent, often with the deliberate intent to subjugate or cause them harm. For far too long, First Nations people of this land have endured the devastating impacts of colonisation, including the theft of ancestral lands, the forced removal of their children, and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their language, heritage and culture. For far too long, these injustices have been allowed to prolong the pain and hardship that still affects our First Nations community today through the intergenerational legacy of trauma and suffering, one that we as a government have a profound moral obligation to address in any way that's within our capacity. The concept of a First Nations voice to Parliament is not a new one. It's well known. We see it in a range of global jurisdictions where First Nations and Indigenous people have a formal body through which to make representations to their government. The concept is also well known in our nation and state. This particular reform has been the subject of 6 months of extensive consultation around South Australia. It's almost 6 years since the Uluru Statement from the Heart was handed down, and it's 187 years overdue. We have nothing to fear from the First Nations voice, and we have everything to gain. It will not diminish any single one of us. Quite the opposite is true. What diminishes us is the suffering of Aboriginal people enduring throughout our history. What diminishes us is that Aboriginal people were denied a voice in shaping the decisions that affected their lives for so long. A First Nations voice helping to guide better outcomes for Aboriginal people and communities in this state will elevate every single South Australian. I've heard people put forward the objection that establishing a voice to Parliament will create further division between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people on the basis of race. That position is not reflective of the fact that such division already very much exists. To suggest otherwise is both insulting to Aboriginal Australians and utterly incorrect on the basis of observable fact. That division is deeply entrenched, and the consequences arising from that division are why we see the education outcomes, the economic outcomes, the health outcomes and the life expectancy outcomes that we do for First Nations South Australians. That division is the very force that created the gap that we try to close. Some have warned that we will see ugly and hurtful expressions of racism as part of this journey. Of course we will. We already have. But if we avoided making significant reforms on the fear of drawing out the worst in a small minority, we'd never see progress. Just imagine telling Rosa Parks or Charlie Perkins not to get on those buses or to challenge the status quo for fear of drawing out racism and hatred. Campaigns like these do come at a cost, and it's one that's borne most heavily by those to whom bigoted and hateful people are already inclined to denigrate and vilify. But that cost is far outweighed by the transformative outcomes and reforms that things like this can achieve. And far from dividing us, this legislation is precisely aimed at helping Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal South Australians walk together. It will enable us to find ways together, not only to remedy the consequences arising from the division that has already been allowed to persist for too long, but to begin to mend that division itself. From more than 200 years of history and from my own personal experience, I know that in order for us to be successful in mending that division, Aboriginal people must have the ability to make representations to this parliament and to this government, to have a voice in their processes. And frankly, it's my view that Aboriginal South Australians have been exceptionally patient in waiting for that opportunity to be properly heard. It's been slow and often excruciating as a journey to arrive at the point we do today. Let us make them wait no longer for access to this crucial avenue of participation in our democracy that will elevate our whole community and help us realise a fairer and more just future for all. It was well more than 50 years ago, at the 1967 referendum, that Aboriginal people were counted. And through the First Nations voice proposed in this bill, we propose that we will be heard. I commend this important historic bill to members and seek leave to insert the explanation clauses into Hansard without my reading them.